Today we're going to talk about something called literary criticism. Literary criticism is something that might be new to a lot of people. What it is the idea that the way people read literature is different based on sort of the philosophy behind why or how people read. So different people will sort of look for different things. They're going to pay attention to different things. And that means they're going to interpret a text differently. There are a lot of different schools of thought or a lot of different types of criticism. And we're going to start with sort of a basic, and it's one that we're going to use the most this year. And it's something called new criticism. And some of what we're about to talk about might actually sound really familiar to you. You just never knew that there was sort of a theory behind it. So literary criticism starts really in the 1930s. Up until this, people were mostly concerned with the beauty of literature. They called it the aesthetic tradition. So in other words, what people paid attention to was sort of the form. Think of Shakespeare with iambic pentameter. Certain forms were considered beautiful, and that beauty meant that it sort of would reach the audience better or have a better impact on the audience. New criticism is a rejection of that. The 1930s, science was becoming increasingly important, and new criticism was a school of thought that said we need to be more scientific about literature. So they developed something called close reading, which probably sounds really familiar to you. This was the idea that the text or the literature stood in isolation. You didn't need to know who the author was. You didn't need to know when it was written or what was going on in the country. You didn't need to know the culture. None of it. All that mattered were the words on the page in front of you. So this was a more scientific approach because it got rid of beauty didn't matter. None of those things mattered. What mattered was, what does the text say? And how do we know that that's what it's saying? So it was an appreciation of the words. This is kind of what you're going to need to be able to do on the AP test, for example. You won't have any context for what you're reading. You need to just look at the words and rely on your interpretation. So this is a really, really good thing to get comfortable with. So there's a chain, and if you have your handout that you got in class, you're going to look at this. And I'm going to walk you through how this chain is connected. So new criticism starts with looking for symbols. They believed, new critics, that all texts have symbols, ideas that aren't literal. So this can be figurative language, this can be the use of metaphor, whatever it is. They said there are things that just aren't literal, and we need to look for those and start our interpretation. They believed that symbols would often have more than one possible meaning. In fact, they believed symbols almost always would have more than one possible meaning. And that led to the next step, which was something called paradox. So in other words, if a symbol has two separate meanings, then there's some sort of paradox because that symbol can't mean two different things. So new critics believe that all texts were inherently contradictory. There were going to be parts that sort of didn't agree with one another. All of this might sound really strange, but in your next video, you're going to watch an example of close reading, and hopefully this will make a little bit more sense for you. Paradox leads to ambiguity. In other words, if there are contradictions, that means there are going to be things that are unclear in the text. And that sort of makes sense. If the text is contradicting itself, that leads us as the readers to say, okay, so what's going on then? What does this mean? Now I'm confused because I'm in this gray area. Ambiguity leads to tension. This means that there are competing ideas, and this is where interpretation comes in. If I have two separate meanings for the same idea in a text, I need to figure out how to reconcile that. I need to figure out how to make sense of this, and that's where my own interpretation comes in. But this can only happen after I've identified those symbols, I've identified what that paradox is and where the ambiguity is, and now I'm going to try to make sense of this tension that creates, or that ambiguity creates in the text. New critics believe that tension, these sort of contradictions, this is where interpretation really lives. It's where we try to figure out what's actually going on and make sense of it. So in order to make sense of this tension, new critics believe that sometimes we're going to interpret certain things ironically. Irony is not a step new critics will always hit, but sometimes it's one of the ways that they sort of resolve these contradictions. So if you have two competing symbols or two competing ideas, you can say, well, one of them is ironic. So one of them isn't a literal message. That's one way to do it. Sometimes that feels like a little bit of a cop-out. Irony, though, think of Handmaid's Tale. There were obviously some contradictions in that text, in the way she used certain ideas and certain symbols. So like we had a lot of biblical references, but they were being twisted and used by the society, and we got that she wasn't really being serious. That's a place where irony is useful. It's not always. Some texts will lend themselves to it more than others. The whole goal is to look for a pattern. You want to look for certain things that come up over and over again. Certain types of ambiguities, certain types of tensions. Does it seem like two ideas are constantly sort of butting up against one another? That is where you're going to get at theme. And again, if all of this seems a little fuzzy right now, hopefully the example reading will help walk you through this a little bit easier. But just remember, you need to look for patterns. So if you spot an ambiguity, if you say, okay, well, here's where there's some disagreement, what you want to keep looking for is, are there other places where similar disagreements exist? Now you have a pattern. Now you can assume that there's some sort of theme to this. And the goal is to lead to unity. At the end, we come to a unified meaning or a theme for the text. Always remember, highlight this, put flashing lights around it, whatever you need to do. The goal of new criticism is to get to a unified meaning. So they believe that all of these inherent contradictions aren't just there to sort of be confusing or because they actually do contradict each other, but because they're helping to sort of illuminate a greater truth. Again, if all of this sounds fuzzy, hopefully the model reading will help you. The last part that's really, really important with new criticism is the role of the author. This was revolutionary. And this is something that I think is actually really empowering for AP students. For centuries, the ultimate authority on a text was the author. They knew what they intended, they knew what they meant, so whatever the meaning was, it came from the author. New critics rejected this. They called that an intentional fallacy. So the belief was, it doesn't matter what the author intended. The text itself is the final authority, not the author. In other words, as long as your interpretation is backed up by the text, it doesn't matter if that's intended. Think back to the One Story article we read and the idea that sometimes things pop up in a text that maybe the author wasn't even aware they were doing because sort of other influences were working in the back of their mind, or maybe they picked this up without realizing it. New critics sort of acknowledged that that happened and said, so that's why the text itself matters more than the author. This means when we're working in class, you don't need to worry about what did Shakespeare mean this? Did Margaret Atwood mean this? It doesn't matter. That text isn't theirs anymore. It's ours. It's ours as readers. And this is one of the contributions of new criticism that I think is the most helpful. So all of this is great. All of this is maybe a little fuzzy. And really, to make sense of it, we're going to need to look at a reading together. We're going to need to practice and see what this looks like. So at this point, read through that handout that you have. Hopefully the chain of events, how symbols lead to paradox, lead to ambiguity, leads to all of this. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully the next video where we actually do a model reading will clarify it even more.